October 26, 1955 is a special day in Austrian history. On this day, the last occupying troops withdrew from the country and neutrality has been firmly anchored in Austrian foreign policy ever since. Since 1965, October 26 has therefore also been Austria's national holiday. But how did this declaration of neutrality come about, and how was Austria able to remain neutral despite joining the EU and the expansion of NATO in neighboring countries? As early as the 1920s, after the end of the First World War, there was a discussion about Austria's possible neutrality. Due to its location in the center of Europe, Austria was in danger of being invaded or annexed by another major European power at any time. However, the supporters of this thesis were not able to prevail at the time, as on the one hand many were in favor of a rapprochement with Italy and Hungary, and on the other hand many Austrians of German origin wanted to join Germany, which later happened. After the end of the Second World War, Austria, like Germany, was divided into 4 occupation zones and thus became caught up in the growing East-West conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union. This was particularly evident in the fact that the future of Austria was debated for a very long time because both sides feared that the country would fall under the influence of the enemy if it withdrew. The West feared that Austria could be incorporated into the Eastern Bloc, while the Soviet Union did not want the country to fall into the hands of the USA and the West. A lot of time passed, particularly because the Soviet Union did not agree to the withdrawal of its troops, and it was only after Stalin's death in 1953 that the negotiations were accelerated. As the Paris Treaties of 1954 finally decided on the division of Germany and the admission of the FRG to NATO, Moscow insisted on unconditional neutrality in the event of a withdrawal from Austria. Thus, on April 15, 1955, the so-called Moscow Memorandum was signed, in which Austria was obliged to declare itself militarily neutral of its own free will after the withdrawal of the occupying troops. The Austrian State Treaty of 1955 thus prohibited Austria from entering into military alliances and establishing foreign military bases on Austrian territory. It must therefore remain strictly neutral in military terms. In the following decades, however, this neutrality was repeatedly put to the test. In 1956, shortly after the treaty was signed, the Soviet Union crushed a popular uprising in neighboring Hungary, with the newly formed Austrian sovereign tasked with securing the borders against armed troops. Fortunately, the Soviet army did not violate Austria's state border at the time, which meant that no firing orders had to be given. In 1968, when the Soviet Union put down the Prague Spring uprisings in Czechoslovakia, Austria was also faced with the dilemma that Soviet troops were operating not far from its national border. However, no borders were violated here either, which is why the order to shoot did not have to be given. Nevertheless, Austria took a clear foreign policy stance and strongly condemned the Soviet Union's actions. Another problem was the aspiration to join the EU. Until the mid-1980s, accession was considered incompatible with neutrality in Austria. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that the general understanding of neutrality changed and Austria was able to join the EU on January 1, 1995 without opposition from other countries. Austria has now been neutral for 67 years, which has earned it a reputation as a reliable and impartial mediator for international diplomacy. Not only were meetings between American and Soviet politicians repeatedly held in Vienna during the Cold War, but several high-ranking international organizations are also based there today. For example, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and the International Nuclear Energy Organizations. These all have their headquarters in Vienna. However, some experts at the Vienna National Defense Academy argue that Austria's neutrality in the traditional sense no longer really exists today. Particularly due to the ever closer cooperation between the EU and NATO in security policy, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Austria to adopt a neutral stance. For example, during the Kosovo War in 1999, Austrian airspace was used by the USA and the NATO coalition to fly air strikes against Serbia. Austria had not actually permitted this and therefore protested diplomatically, but Austria did not defend itself militarily and did not deploy any interceptors. This illustrates the dilemma that Austria has to face in its foreign policy. In other words, mastering the balancing act between neutrality and supporting its European and Western partners.